So we all know that React can be rendered on the client or on the server. So in a typical client-side rendered React app, how it works is essentially the server sends a mostly empty HTML file, and along with this HTML, it's also going to send in a bunch of JavaScript files. Now this JavaScript is responsible to actually populate the HTML with valid content. So since JavaScript has to build it on the client, thoda delay ho sakta hai because obviously this is like a memory intensive task. So you may not see content on the page right away. And because of this, SEO also might take a hit. So the solution that folks came up with was server-side rendering. And in case of server-side rendering, what happens is anytime I go to the domain, I make a request and it generates an HTML page with content already filled in. This HTML page is then sent back to the browser. But there's one thing that's missing in this page, at least initially, which is interactivity. So if there are buttons or input fields in your app and you try to interact with them right away when you see the HTML content loaded in the browser, there is a good chance that you might not be able to interact with it. Clicking on a button would do nothing. If you try to type in something inside an input field, kuch nahi hoga. This happens because the application that is rendered on the server and returned back to the client has to be hydrated. So I'll take Next.js for example because Next.js does this very well. Going back to the previous example, server is going to send down a full HTML page, which is fast, SEO friendly, users can see the content instantly. Perfect. But since it is static, no interactivity, your app may feel like a React app, but it doesn't behave like one because there are no click handlers, no state, nothing on the page. So iske liye kuch to karna padega. Now hydration is a process where the browser is going to attach event handlers, state, all the things that make a React app reactive to the static HTML. The thing that actually gives life to a React app, that is hydration. This will be needed in a server-side rendered app because we get static content. In case of a client-side rendered app, you don't really need it because anyway, everything is happening on the client. While React's JavaScript is building the HTML, it's also attaching the event listeners and the state. So it is essentially kind of hydrating on the client anyway. So if you go to the docs, right, you'll find this hydrate root method. This hydrate root method is part of React DOM client, and even in Next.js behind the scenes, this is what's used in order to hydrate a server rendered HTML. So what it does is it attaches all the client-side React behavior to the previously server rendered HTML that we got back from the React server. Also, one thing that I need to mention, the server that I keep saying, this is not like a separate standalone service that is handling your API requests as well. This is the same server on which you will run your React app. When you go to localhost 3000 or 5173, it actually makes a request to the React server and the React server is going to give you the HTML, the server rendered HTML. So yeah, this hydrate root method takes in the DOM node as the first param. So this is essentially the root DOM element containing the server rendered HTML. It also takes the React node as the second param that's meant to match this root node. Anyway, this method is used in Next.js as well and you don't really have to manually call it. Next.js sab khud se handle kar leta hai behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about it. Even in case of other server-side rendering frameworks, all of this is taken care of behind the scenes. So if we have pre-rendered HTML, we are calling this hydrate root method, but I'm assuming most of you have worked with client-side rendered React because that is the norm. And in case of client-rendered React, you would see an alternate method called create root. So create root handles it for us in client-side rendering, but we have to hydrate content in case of server-side rendering. So we use hydrate root. The problem with hydration is that there are a lot of issues as well. So React assumes client-side markup to match with the content provided by the server. Even in the server, React is responsible for creating the content. Again, React is now going to set up the VDOM on the client and is then going to check. Reconciliation will happen between the client rendered DOM and the server rendered DOM, and there should not be any mismatch between these two. So Next.js has a common list of hydration errors. At the top, you see that it tells you why this happens. Between the React tree that was pre-rendered from the server and the React tree that was rendered during the first render on the browser, everything has to be the same. So the common causes, as you can see here, firstly is incorrect nesting of HTML tag. So there are certain set of unsaid rules in case of HTML nesting. If you nest a paragraph tag inside another paragraph tag, it's invalid. Similarly, div cannot be inside a paragraph tag. Unordered list, ordered list cannot be inside a paragraph tag. Anchor tags cannot be nested inside another anchor tag, and similarly button also cannot be nested inside a button. All of these are unsaid HTML rules, and if you don't follow these rules, then it's going to give you that hydration error. Second point is you basically cannot have checks for window object. In the server rendered app, there is no window, right? Because this is happening on the server and it's most likely a Node.js server, you're not really going to get the window object there, but you will get it inside the client rendered React app. So the moment that happens, when client app and server app are being matched, you'll find this issue because window is only present inside the client app and it's going to accordingly render something else. This normally we use to conditionally render or hide something. And if this is being used inside the React app, most likely there is going to be a mismatch because client will have something extra. Server will not have this because server doesn't have a window object. Similarly, point number 3 is more or less the same. Window object or local storage, you can't use browser only APIs on the server. So the moment server renders a page without content that's dependent on the window object or the local storage, it is going to not match with the client app because client will have access to both of these APIs. So yeah, window related kuch bhi hai you can't really use. Fourth point is a little bit different. You cannot really use time dependent APIs such as the date constructor because I'll actually give you a hypothetical. So if you are trying to render a timestamp that depends on your current time zone or current time in general, then by the time this component is rendered on the server, sent back to the client, the time may have changed a little bit. 1-2 second का gap हो सकता है, and the moment there is a gap, there will be a mismatch. If you try to use like mat.random somewhere in your application, it will give you more or less the same problem because when you're building the HTML on the server, it is going to run mat.random. It is going to render a random number. If you do the same thing on the client, if both of the numbers are not the same, you will get the same error. There will be a mismatch between both of these mat.random components. Then browser extensions also modify the HTML. So if you have like Grammarly or any other extension, sometimes they add like a script tag or some meta information to your DOM. All of that is not allowed. So this will again cause a mismatch. So essentially there are a bunch of problems with hydration and we have to be mindful about when to use server-side rendering and when to go back to client-side rendering. So ideally we should go by a set of rules when to use client-side or server-side rendered components. Yeah, if you see here, it says if you're using state or event handlers like onClick, onChange, go with client components. Main responsibility of managing state and event handlers is with the browser. So if that is the case, you should go with client-side rendered components. If you have any lifecycle logic for which you use effect, go back to client rendered components. If there are any browser only APIs like window object, local storage, we just looked at this like a minute ago. Any browser related APIs, go with client rendering, client-side rendering. And if you have any custom hooks, again, go with client-side rendering. The reason why we have to use client-rendered components if you're using custom hooks is because custom hooks normally depend upon use state or use effect. So if you're using that, you have to make use of client, so might as well render it over there. Server-side rendered components can be used if you have to fetch data from database or APIs close to the source. You can basically make the API request, render the component with the data from the API and then give it back. This makes much more sense if you are actually handling backend on the Next.js app itself. So yeah, if you're using API keys, tokens and other secrets, ideally you should prefer having it inside a server rendered component because exposing it to the client can potentially create security vulnerabilities. So you don't want that. If you want to reduce the amount of JavaScript that gets sent to the browser, again, go with server-side rendering. Because in case of server-side rendering, it's only going to give you back the HTML file with the content already pre-populated by React on the server. So it's not going to return the JavaScript back to the client. So if that is the case, you can go with server components. And again, if you want to improve FCP, SEO scores, you should go with server components because it is going to give you something right away. Even though it won't be interactive initially, there is content on the page. So it becomes easier for crawlers to crawl this page and subsequently it increases your FCP score and SEO score. So go by these rules when you're thinking of rendering a component on the client versus on the server. One quick side note in case of Next.js that I forgot to mention is that even though they're called client components, they are still server-side rendered first and then hydrated in the browser. So when you request a page, Next.js runs the rendering process on the server for both server and client components. The HTML for the client component is generated on the server, just like a server component's HTML. This HTML is then sent to the browser, so you see content immediately. Alongside the HTML, Next.js also sends back JavaScript for client components. So once the JavaScript loads in the browser, React is going to hydrate the HTML, attaching event listeners, enabling use state, use effect, and any other interactive logic. After hydration, your client component behaves like a normal React component in the browser. It can re-render, respond to events, fetch data inside use effect. All of it is enabled after hydration. So key difference between a server component and a client component is that server component are rendered on the server only. No JavaScript is sent to the browser and no hydration is required. In case of client component, it's rendered on the server and is hydrated on the browser so it can become interactive. If you take a look at this example, on the first load, HTML for the h1 tag and the button comes from the server. The button already appears with the count before JavaScript runs. Now after JavaScript loads, React is going to hydrate the counter and the button becomes clickable. So that is how this would work. Client and server components both are rendered on the server. It's just that the hydration happens on the client. And yeah, that is pretty much it for this video. Let me know if you want more content on server-side rendering. Maybe we can build an app covering all of this and take a look at it in a more practical way. If you're new here, do subscribe to the channel. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.